Our two presenters today are both from KU. Erin Wolfe is our KU metadata librarian. You all met Erin at our workshop in South Carolina. And our second presenter is Jamene Brooks-Kieffer. She's the KU data service librarian there at KU Libraries. And I'll toss it over to them now.
All right, thank you, Sarah. I am going to interrupt the proceedings briefly to share the slides on my screen. And you can see what we see, we can see what you see. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about some better practices for project management. We don't claim best practices because we don't really think that's sustainable or achievable. So we're hoping to offer you some things that maybe are immediately useful, things that you can put into practice on this project and on other projects going forward. So Sarah has done our introductions for us. Thank you, Sarah. We are going to be framing the topic of project management. We'll talk a little bit about principles of naming files and folders or directories, whichever naming you prefer. We'll talk about some principles of documentation, and then we will also do a use case for each of these principles, time permitting. And what's going to happen is I will talk about file naming and directory management, and then show you a use case for that topic. And then Erin's going to take over and talk about documentation, and then walk us through a use case for that topic. Anything you miss during this presentation, we have the slides and some other materials available in a OneDrive folder. I have sent the link to Sarah, and she will be able to offer those materials to you in a place where you can get them. If nothing else, just feel free to email one of either me or Erin, and we can share that link with you. Dangers to projects include forgetting that you have animation on your slides. So whether you are working with analog tools or digital tools, there is an element of danger in conducting a project. You might spill coffee on your notebook and it was written in water-soluble ink, and that's a problem. You might dump coffee into your laptop. You know, we all are working with food and drinks and digital objects all of the time, and so this is a real danger. These are things that we might be able to get back, but we really can't guarantee. Natural disasters are also a danger to our projects, as well as we ourselves. Our human brains are terrible dangers to the projects in terms of forgetting what things are, forgetting where we put them, being asked at a critical moment, I need to see your data, I need to see your process, and we can't find it. And the literature is full of retractions and instances of research or articles that have been pulled just because of these very issues, just people not being able to find their stuff. So this is hopefully what we're going to address today. When we're talking about any project that you're working on, I want to emphasize that this is your labor. This is your intellectual work. And if it's worth doing in an intentional manner so that it's available to you in the future. And that future could be 3 weeks, it could be 3 years. It doesn't really matter. If it's important enough to do, it's important enough to be able to find later on. So we're going to focus today on 2 practices that you can apply both to your BBIP projects and to any other work that you're doing. In terms of organization, we're going to talk about, as I said, naming files and folders systematically. For documentation, Erin's going to talk about taking notes on all facets of a project and recording the invisible work that you do as part of your project. When I talk to students about data management, the thing that I always emphasize is the selfishness aspect. Help your future self. You have collaborators, you have responsibilities to your departments, to your other faculty, to your funders, but really the most important collaborator is you. So focus on that future self that will really thank you when you come back to something in 2 or 3 or 5 years. So here is an example of what could happen to your future self when files and directories aren't organized. I really think it's unlikely that anybody could return to this directory in a few months or a year and successfully identify that document that they're looking for without having to open 3, 4, 5 different files. And when you compound that time over a bigger project, a project that's gone on over the long term, searching for those files really starts to be a major source of frustration and a big source of wasted time. And you could spend that time in much more productive ways. So the first topic for helping your future self is to name files using an intentional system, and then to create and use an intentional directory structure. It's really easy for a librarian to say, oh, get organized. But there are steps to doing that. There are processes, and so that's what we hope that you take away from this today. KU Libraries has some videos on both of these topics. When you're ready for a refresher, feel free to go watch them. There are 7 videos total. All of them are 3 minutes or under. So this is really not a time-intensive undertaking to go watch those videos, and they're all at the link that you see on the screen. So I'm going to demonstrate, the use cases for me to demonstrate a couple of these techniques in a few minutes, but for now, I want to walk you through the basics of naming files and directories and talk a little bit about why this advice is relevant. So the first thing that you can do in naming your files and directories is to keep your name short and to use a system for doing so. And both Windows and Mac operating systems make it very easy for us to just have long directory and file names. And just because we can doesn't mean that we should. There are hard limits on the path length, definitely in Windows, and I suspect in Mac as well. And when you hit those limits, you can delete the file. The operating system can behave in really unpredictable ways. Delete the file, not name it uniquely, all sorts of bizarre behaviors can happen. So keeping names short works to your advantage in the long run. Not putting spaces in your file names also works to your advantage in the long run. You can run all the words together with capitalization in between. This is called camel case. Or you can use an underscore or a dash character to separate words if you need to. The space character can really mess with certain software. It doesn't necessarily translate well across operating systems. So if you are working on a Windows machine and your collaborator is working on a Mac, things can get kind of interesting. So it's easier to just not put spaces in the beginning. We also want to avoid special characters in our file names and our directory names. Again, these can, in certain circumstances, tell the operating system to do something with that file that you don't want it to do. Cut the file name off, delete it, confuse it with something else. Again, in that collaboration scenario, maybe just have it not work for your collaborator or for yourself. So these are good characters to avoid in your file and folder names. The standard date format, this is actually an international standard. It's ISO 8601, if you're curious. 4 characters of year, 2 characters of month, 2 characters of day. And this does several different things. First of all, if it's in a systematically placed part of your file name, you can sort your files chronologically using the name without relying on the system date. The system date is not reliable because it's going to change every time you open the file, edit the file, share the file, move the file to another directory. That system date is not a reliable indicator of the actual date of the file, which you may care about quite a bit. The other thing that this does is eliminates confusion among collaborators. The United States uses a month, day, year scheme for dates. the EU, other countries use a different scheme. They put day, month, year. So if everybody can agree on the international standard at the beginning of a collaboration, there's nobody thinking that the meeting is in April when the meeting is actually on the 4th day of the month. So we can eliminate confusion that way. Another thing that you can do is to add leading zeros to any numbers that are relevant to your file names. These allow the computer to sort your files chronologically, or not chronologically, I'm sorry, in date and number order, as opposed to maybe putting the 10s with the 1s and the 20s with the 2s. This gets really confusing to people. To the computer, it makes perfect sense. So here we're sort of adapting our practice a bit to be a little more forgiving of what the computer wants to do. And in order to name our files systematically, the big thing is to think about what is important to you about those files. Is it the author? Is it some keywords? Is it a date? Is it, if you were conducting interviews or something, maybe the initials of the interview subject, or whatever, or the subject number if you're concealing identities. Anything that's important about that to you, particularly as you acquire a set of files, multiple files, sort of all along the same lines, and you need to distinguish those via the file name. Applying these attributes in the same order every time is going to keep like files together. And this consistency is going to help your computer help you when you need to sort in order to say, find the earliest or the latest file, or if you need to search, particularly when you are naming pictures, video files, audio files, anything that the computer can't search for within a text because there isn't text. Having that really solid file name can help you find that file when you need it. In order to structure your directories, I keep saying this word system and systematic, so you're hopefully picking up how important this is. Picking a system and sticking to it is really the most important thing. Again, being consistent, applying a practice over time, those are the most important things you can do. Other things you can do are to use a thematic hierarchy where the top level, the directory that everything else about the project contains is the highest level of the hierarchy. And then as things get more detailed, you work those in internally inside that top level folder. If you have 3 or more files about the same topic, it really does deserve its own directory just to help you keep things straight. And again, as with file naming, consistency is what is going to be the biggest helper for you later on. So I have for you a directory structure example that is probably a bit much in terms of what you need for your BBIP project. But I wanted to show it to you to give you an example of a highly structured directory system and what it can do. So this is the prescriptive directory structure for KU's Center for Research Methods and Data Analysis. These are the quantitative statistics people on campus. And they take in projects primarily on contract, both from internal and external clients. And so they need a really rigorous system in place for keeping their PIs, their graduate students, all of the people doing stuff on a project, doing things in the correct way so that the results can be communicated to the client in a reliable and cost-efficient manner. So the things you'll notice for the data subdirectory, there's a note that this data is read-only. And this is really important because as you are, whether you're collecting quantitative data or qualitative data or something else, your raw data really should be read-only, because if something gets screwed up, you need to always be able to go back to that raw data to start over if you need to. Give yourself a place to start over from. The working data directory is where all of the work happens. The idea for this structure is that this working data directory could be wiped out and everything would still be fine because the raw data is untouched and everything could be regenerated from code, and the code is somewhere else, is in a programming language or a different statistical program. Literature is reading material, things that we write are in the write-up, and then a temp directory for trash. You know, sometimes we're not ready to delete things right away, but we want a place to put them as like, I think I'm done with this, but I want to hang on to it. But you don't have to look at it every day, and you can use a folder like that to kind of periodically just clean up your workspace, which can really help a lot. So for the example, for the use case, I'm going to use a modified version of that prescriptive directory structure to show you. And there's an example in the shared folder that Sarah has access to. So you'll be able to follow along with that later on if you want to. You don't have to write it down right now. So in this first use case, which is going to take probably 5 minutes, because then I have to give the mic over to Erin, I'm going to show you making a Windows directory structure. And I'm using a Windows machine. If you are on a Mac, the process is going to be slightly different, but the principle is going to remain the same. And then I have some downloaded articles from JSTOR that I want to offer you some suggestions for renaming. And then we're going to move those files into that new structure. And so I'm going to beg your patience for a minute while I switch my screen sharing to not the slides. All right, so I'm going to share with you my file system view so you can see all the stuff that's on my desktop. So this is my desktop folder for my Windows computer. And rather than bury it deeply into the file system, I'm just going to do this on the desktop. I believe the example document does this in the documents directory, but it's really up to you as to where you put this. So we were talking about a thematic hierarchy for a project. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a new folder for my project. Just call it project. There we go. And I'm going to open that folder. And we're just going to do that again. So you can, if you're on Windows, you can do this either with the new folder button, or you can do a right click and new folder, whatever works for you, either way. So my first folder that I'm going to create, you will recognize from that prescriptive directory structure. So this is the data folder. And we're just going to keep working. So data, and then a second one for analysis, whether it's code, whether it's web-based tools, any kind of qualitative analysis software, anything that you are using to make sense of your data could go into this directory. And let's do another one. I'm going to call this viz, and I know some people do that with a Z and some people do it with an S. I'm not terribly prescriptive about it. So this would be for any visualizations that you do of your project, any kind of graphs or charts. Maybe you're going to do a word frequency, or you have some kind of visual output from a piece of qualitative software, your own drawings. Any of those could go into a visualization directory. So a new one for literature. So things that we are collecting, secondary readings that we need to inform our practice, our project, as we move forward in our intellectual work. One for writing, things that we write. that temp folder that we can use as a temporary trash can if we need to. And then one more, and this one I think is really important and can save you so much later on. I've created a folder called Final, and so this is where I would put the submitted version or the submitted or the corrected version of a publication or any slides that I presented at a meeting, that presented version, that published or accepted version, any kind of visualizations that I created, that because those go through so many tweaks, that final thing, because often when you come back to a project, what you want is the last part, and creating a separate directory makes that so much easier for yourself later on. So Erin pointed out to me yesterday when we were talking about this, that once you have this structure, let me go back into that project folder. Once you have this structure, you could just keep it as a template and then copy it for a new project over and over and over. So you don't necessarily have to fill this one out. You could keep it as a template and then just copy the whole thing and populate it as your new projects develop. In my 2 seconds remaining, I want to take you back up to the desktop and I want to show you, so these two files with numbers, these are actually articles that I downloaded from JSTOR, and this is the default name that JSTOR gives them, which is really dreadful. And I don't, because of this name, like I know what articles I downloaded, but I'm not really sure what they are just by looking at them. So I'm not going to open them right now, but I want to show you what a systematic naming convention for downloaded literature might look like. So I'm just going to take a guess that this is what this is. So I'm going to start with the first author's last name. I'm going to do an underscore, I think that was 1947, and then this was an article about hats. And that's it. The other one, come on, let's see, I think Henderson, I think it was 1986, and I think this one was about feathers. And I can make some choices when I'm putting my system together. If the thing that's the most important for me is the author's last name, I want to have that as the first element. If I would rather sort these by publication date, I can put the publication date as the first element. It doesn't really matter. It's just what's most important for you. So at this point, I am going to pick both of these up. I'm going to try to pick both of these up. No, it's not going to cooperate. I'm going to move this into the project folder, and all I have to do is click and drag. Yep, there goes one. And here goes the other one. And once they've moved into the project folder, now I want to put them both into that lit folder, because again, these are secondary sources that we have downloaded to inform our own work. And because I'm doing this, I never have to wonder, where is that article? What did I do with it? It's always in that folder. And if we use that directory structure for every project, that really does eliminate a lot of cognitive load in terms of just what you have the brain space to think about. So I do have a slide that I am not going to talk through, but it's going to be there for you later on that, like those choices about organizing your own literature, what you name it, and how you, how you make those choices, what's sustainable for you over the long term. I'm going to pause the share and switch back to the slides. And then I'm going to turn this over to Erin to talk us through some documentation practices.
So I think I'm from here. So the second big part of this is to document everything and anything that you would want to remember later. And there's some examples here that are listed, such as if you've chosen a file naming system, like Jamene just talked about, why did you choose that? Is there a key reason why it's done that way? Where did you put things? Again, if you follow that directory structure or something like it that works for you, great. But the bigger your project, the more sort of subdirectories you might get, and making note of specific files, any codes or abbreviations, where did the data come from, who else worked on the project with you. Those are some examples. And this link at the bottom there is the library's, KU library's page on this, and it's got a lot of helpful information and links out for that. So, but just think about it from the perspective of, if you came back to these files in 3 years, how easily could you get back up to speed with what you have? Or if you brought in a new collaborator, or the way that I personally approach it is, mentally this works for me. If I got hit by a bus and someone had to take over, how easily could they get up to what I was doing and make sense of that? Okay, so it's a good habit to get into, to just create documentation for every project that you work on. Excuse me. If you do something like that directory structure and make a template of that directory structure, you can even put in little template documentation files into that, so it's already there with each project that you create. And you want to document the project at the top level, but then documenting different aspects of your project. So where did the data come from? If you've got publications, if you've got a folder of visualizations, what do they all mean? If you've got 20 different files in there, you can make a list just to make it that much easier to get at what you're looking for. And again, the bigger the project, the more there's going to be, and the more help it's going to be in the long run. And so to do this, there's some tools and methods that I'm going to talk about here in a minute. But the key to keep in mind through all this is to keep it realistic for you, and to keep it as consistent as you can. So if you go online and look at documenting a README file, for instance, and you look at all the different examples, there's a huge variety, and some of them are very, very detailed and very long and very overwhelming. So don't bite off more than you can chew. Think about what you need, what makes sense for you, and how much you think you can keep up. And you can always expand later, the more you get into it, and see what other sorts of documentation you need to keep for a given project. So these are some of the accepted tools and methods for creating documentation. And each of these, I'm pretty sure there's a separate reading in the readings that Sarah sent out prior to this webinar. Each of these has a linked reading. And if you haven't, I would highly recommend just going and looking at that. They're pretty short, easy to digest, and have lots of good information. So your notes is a good one if you do a good job of taking notes, if they're thorough and detailed. A README, I'm going to talk a little bit more about, but basically it's a text file, and it's written in plain text so that it's accessible through a lot of different programs or different software or operating systems, easily shareable. And the one you can think of it sort of as a front door or the face to your project, and it should have all of the information that somebody needs to know about your project. And this can be a couple sentences, just to give a little description if that's all that's required, or it can be a sort of broken out, again, where did the data come from, who worked on the project, what is this for, what outcomes came out of this. And since it's just a little text file, you can put them at any different level of your directory structure. And again, it could be a detailed description, or like with a visualization directory, it could be, you could just list them out and say what they are, what software you use to make them. If you made any decisions that you made about the files. And again, if it's called README, it's simple. People can make sense of what that is, and they know what to do with that file. Templates can be really useful, and I sort of made allusion to this earlier. There's a sample one project template in the folder that Sarah is going to share with you. But it just helps you to create consistent documentation between projects, between collaborators, make sure things are collected in the same way, make sure you don't forget about things. You can just think through all of the things that you need to capture, and you can create your own, or you can use the one as a guide and go from there. And then the last one, code books and data dictionaries. Those are often used for more formal collecting of data, for published data research and things like that. But if you think about a spreadsheet, if you're collecting data on a spreadsheet, what do the column headers actually mean? If you're using abbreviations in them or variables, what do those mean? What sort of entries should someone expect to find in a given field, for instance? And so then a little bit more about so again, there's a lot of really discipline-specific examples out there, but there's not a one-size-fits-all. The important thing to remember is to make sure that all necessary documentation is included for someone to make sense of the materials, but then also that all included content is justified. So is there a reason that you're putting it in there? But you also want to just explain it as well as possible. And again, there's anything that needs explaining, a README file is a good place to explain it. And if you go in and you make changes, if there's been updates to a file version, or if you change your file naming structure or system, or you can just make a note of that and just use it as a log and a record of what you have there. And then also, if you're going to, at any point, put these files into a repository of some sort, or submit them for some sort of preservation, the README files can be essential just to help maintain their usefulness. Because if you've got good data with bad documentation, then it's kind of useless, or potentially useless. And so the other thing that I wanted to talk about is something that probably doesn't come real naturally to most people, myself very much included, and this search strategy documentation. And the reasons you would want to do this are basically to keep track of how you got to where you got. So if you think about it, you're searching, either if it's just a Google search or you're in a database. I'm sure it's happened to us all, where you know you've seen something interesting and you can't find it again, or you have to spend another half an hour looking for it, or your computer crashes in the middle of a productive search while you've got a bunch of tabs open. Or if you keep track of what you're doing as you go, it'd be easier to recreate for yourself or for others. You can pick back up if you're interrupted. You can get back to where you were a lot easier, and it can help lend validation to your search process. And so these are some of the examples of things you might keep, but some of the keys are, especially where did you find it and how did you get to it? basically. And if you keep track of that all along the way, then you know, it's when you get started on this, it can seem a bit cumbersome, but it's not that much time, extra time, and so if you just start to get used to the process, it can just be part of the research process. And so I'm checking on the time here. We're doing okay on time. So I was going to just to sort of walk through this search strategy documentation with the literature search. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. So I'm going to walk through just a brief search using JSTOR, but the same principles will apply with anything that you're using, whether it's, and also with searching, but also if you're using tools like the PhiloLogic tool, these same principles can apply, or any of the other visualization things that that you might use. So if I so now this search diary is included in that public folder. So I'm going to sort of walk through this, but then you can, when you get access to that folder, you can look at this and see what it looks like to record that. It's going to be a little too tricky to switch between the browser and the text document to show you as I'm going. So we can talk through it, and then you can go back and look at it later. And hopefully it will all make sense. So if we start here, and I search for something that I'm interested in, that I want to look. So I would, in my search diary or log, I would copy the keywords that I use, and you can actually do this backwards too. You can put them in one place and then just paste them in. How many search results it came up with. You might even just copy the URL. That can be a really easy way to get back to it, to results. And then you can look at what you found. So the first entry then is just keyword search, and then that phrase and how many results you got. And then as I'm going through, if the key aspect of what I'm thinking about, there's a lot of different topics here. So if the key aspect I'm thinking about is feathers, I found this as a clickable topic. And so I can click on that, and then in the search log, I can put that I clicked on the feathers topic, and that brought up 7,825 results. And then if I want to type in symbolism here and search inside of those results, so I would make another quick entry search for symbolism within those results, and how many search results came up from that. And then, so as you scan through, you're just keeping track of what you're doing. And if you find something interesting that you want to, that maybe you're not ready to click on now, but you want to come back to, you could just make a note and say, oh, I found an interesting article, and you could copy the title and say to come back to that, or if other of these topic keywords strike you, but you're not ready to go down there yet, you can make a note of them at this stage and say to come back to that one. And so if we, you also just want to make sure that if you, so for instance, if I search for this symbolism African American, it brings us 16 search results. But if I search for it in quotes, I put African American in quotes, you get no results. So let's make sure that you're keeping track of things like that you do. And again, you can copy the URL too, but it does make it a lot easier to get back to where you came from. And so I'm going to go back just a little bit. But let's say I like this first one, but this is the only result that I found. So you can mark it, and if I wanted to just download this directly, I could make a note of what search I was on when I downloaded this article. And if I click on download, I'm going to do this just to show you this piece here. So it opens it up, and then when I click download here, you can see this is where it gives you that file name like Jamene was mentioning, just these numbers. So if I go to save it, since we've already set up this project folder with the lit review, I'll go right there and I can change it here on the fly and save it with the same file name. So it'd be McGee 1898 and hats or whatever this one was. So since we set up the project folder ahead of time, you've already got a spot to put these. And if you've got your search diary going, you know where it came from. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention too, and we're not going to get into this, it's a little outside the scope of this webinar, but you might think about especially if you're doing a lot of literature reviews, if you don't already, you might consider learning about citation managers. And there's a link in the slides to a KU's guide to some of the citation managers and how to use them. JSTOR makes it nice and easy, so you just select it, and then up here, you probably can't read on your screen, but it says export selected citations, and then you can choose the program or the format, and it will save things in the, it'll save the citations for you, and depending on how you have it set up, you can do a lot of notes and other things from that view. So again, I would recommend at least looking at the KU page for citation managers and seeing if that's something that may be helpful for you. So and we could keep going with these, but again, the point is just to make it just that much easier to get back to where you were and to save you time in the long run. Okay. And then again, this is just sort of an overall reminder thing of things to keep in mind as you get started with documentation. We have a couple pages of resources, and again, you'll have access to the slides, so all of this will be there. But there is our contact information. If you have questions for either of us, I'm sure we'd be happy to talk with you. Is there anything else? So I think that is the end of it.
And I think we have Sarah confirm, if you will, we have a few minutes for questions, if folks have questions.
Yeah, go ahead. Take 2 or 3 minutes if you have questions.
Okay. And we will watch the chat also, so if you don't want to speak, feel free to dump your question into the chat.
Well, I could just say that looking at that, I'm probably doing about less than 20% of what you are proposing. And I also know now why I spend so much time on the computer trying to find the things that I need to work on. So I'm definitely gonna look back over this and see how I can become more efficient.
Well, to your point, this is a journey.
Yeah.
And a practice. So this is not something, people get into their habits of working, we all do, and maybe none of us work as optimally or as efficiently as we think we should. So this is one of those, small steps. We change a little bit at a time, and wherever we are is where we are.
Yeah.
I have one question, which this was great through so many great bits of advice. The question I have is, what additional recommendations or practices are there in terms of when you're doing collaborative work with documentation where multiple people have to contribute things? Are there certain platforms or places that you recommend storing that documentation, or having people do it on their own rather than having people do it on
People routinely use Google Docs to just put everything, dump everything in, but it can get overwhelming.
It can get overwhelming, and if you set it up right, then everybody's working on the same file, and then you don't have 4 people with their own versions that somebody then has to merge together. But if it's not,
Can you repeat the question? We couldn't hear Brian very well.
Repeat the question.
Oh, I was just asking if there are additional recommendations when there are multiple people creating documentation or creating files or data and having to store that in a single place, and thinking about recommended platforms or other practices.
And I mentioned that we use Google Docs a lot to dump stuff in, but that is also getting unmanageable. That was the example I was giving, the one that I'm more familiar with.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that the if it's set up right, Google Docs can be a really good one, because then everyone's working on a single document. But if it's not set up right, then Google will create copies of it, and then you've still got the same problem of you've got multiple versions floating around. So
that is what we've experiencing.
I don't have any real specific ones, but
I have a quick question about strategy for documentation. When I was listening, I heard you mention a diary and or some kind of place where the documentation is recorded, and I was wondering, what is it, in an Excel file? Like, what kind of environment is the diary? Either one.
So it's going to be whatever works for you, really. The example that we have is a plain text file, very much like the README. It's openable across all kinds of operating systems. You can open a text file on your mobile device with almost any piece of software. But if you would prefer to keep it in a spreadsheet or something a little bit more formatted, that's certainly up to you. When you see the shared folder, it's going to be, the file is going to be called JSTOR-searchdiary.txt. So it's really up to you. The one that we've provided is a plain text document. I might recommend starting with a plain text document, and then if you find that you don't like that, then you can always switch to something else.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Were there other questions?
I would encourage you all to email Jamene and Erin as you have questions. They're fantastic resources, and we encourage you to use them. In the interest of time, I'm going to have Mariama take over sort of checking in with each of our groups, give you all a chance to speak to what's been going well, what's not been going well, what questions, concerns you have, so we can get that part finished.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Erin and Jamene for that. I will be one of the first people to make it to your doors, just so you know, because I can see, see or forecast what's working and not working for me. Okay, so I ask you to just think about where you guys are, and if, in fact, it would be useful to talk out what you're doing now, let all of us hear it and see if there's questions, and maybe as you're thinking through a report or an update, what do you want to call it, where you think you are in your data management. I mean, are you at a point where you feel like you got to get more control over all the stuff you're doing, or not? But anyway, I basically want to hear from the teams, language, geography, biography, bibliography, and individually or in your subgroups, because I know there's some clusters within the clusters. So, and I think I asked, but I don't think if anybody responded to whether or not you wanted to start us off in terms of reporting on where the projects are. But some of you emailed me, so I know you got something that's solid, that's happening.
I'm happy to start.
Okay, Kirsten, thank you.
I'll share my camera now. I was eating lunch, but now I'm not. I'm working with a language group, and we, as we learned in North Carolina, we didn't have a lot of pre-conversation before that time. And so after that meeting, we have now divided how we're going to approach the novel. So each one of us is working with about 20 texts. One thing that we have discovered is that moving through multiple digital tools will give us the ability to compare, but we aren't as versed in the UChicago tool as much as we would like to. So the idea of comparison is kind of halting. And so our goal for the next step as a collective is to kind of reach out to Hoyt for some guidance on how to imagine that, so that the metadata that we include is not only thinking about the first layer, but also offering a comparison of like what we discovered through multiple digital tools. And then individually, I think we're starting to either develop or jump into some of the individual interests that we have. So it's been a lot of progress and a lot of pushing, thank you, since our last meeting in March.
Okay. We reminded everybody in the email that we are adding things to the PDFs, all the time. So you might, 2 days later find more things there than there were originally. There are some questions for Hoyt. So if any others of you want to talk to that, because I know there were some consistent questions that they had about using the interface, Hoyt. But thanks, Kirsten. Anybody else from that team? I know, Alicia, you all had said you had something you were going to share too?
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, with the geography group, hello. So yeah, we've been working on trying to put into the spreadsheet some of the books, the list that were given to us to kind of see what are data mining to do with issues to do with space, in particular to do with Black literature and its intersections between like the U.S., the Caribbean, Latin America, we maybe did about 10 books so far, and we're already starting to see some like really interesting data, like to see about what some of the writers that maybe you might consider them African American, but when you dig a little deeper, some of them are actually of like Caribbean descent. So they're like, so through mining that data, especially to do with like geography space, we're seeing like some of the books, especially one author that we are really interested in is Polly Marshall, and seeing some of her works of these kind of like mapping, I would say almost like diasporic mapping across the Caribbean basin, Latin America, where she's kind of retracing, these spaces as a form of identity for herself and her family, but also of the diaspora too. She has a really nice book where she kind of looks at, different parts of like British Guiana, Brazil, Barbados. So it's been really nice to kind of see these kind of intersections or these connections between Black writers across the Americas, and not only here in the United States. So being able to start looking at some of this data to do with geography has really kind of opened that up. Yeah. Kind of provide ideas. Like one of the theories we're looking at is this idea of third space, So, kind of seeing where are the different intersections of like power, knowledge, identity, when we're looking at these authors, and we're kind of mining this data, what does this mean? How can we translate this data into something that's like results as well too, by applying some of the theory. I'll have Marina talk a little bit too.
Well, I don't have that much to add, other than the thing that's really struck me is this notion of travel and experiences of travel that kind of go beyond if you have an idea of someone's national origin, right, or connections to a place, or having lived in a different place other than where you were born. But just also looking at some of the books we've looked at involve travel narratives, the role of travel and identity. And I think that's something yes, that's something I want to continue to explore, how this idea of travel in the literature might also connect to other fields and other experiences. And I've thought, for example, in terms of study abroad in students, right, or people's mobility around the world and looking at mobility studies. So as I've looked at these are some things that are kind of, I'm thinking about and I can't articulate very well, but the seeds are like planted.
Yeah, I can send you a list on mobility and transcultural mobility. So that might be also useful. So you're absolutely right.
Yes.
Mobility studies has tapped into that. Paul Marshall, really interesting because you can find that her early books were showing the sort of development from Barbados to the US, but as she continued her career, she would go back to the Caribbean and rely more on those spatial parameters as opposed to the US side. So she's a good example of someone who starts out in the US and then goes and retrieves more of the earlier experience before he migrated. Well, and she was already in the US, but her family, of course, came from Barbados.
Right.
I think you're right to think about a canon of works by an author, as well as individual works by individual authors.
No, definitely, yeah.
Thank you.
That's what we had to say.
Yeah, thank
Okay,
you.
all right, okay. Who else wants to kind of share a little bit?
All right.
Okay, the workshop people.
So we have a workshop with 7 students from Virginia Tech and from HBCUs in Virginia. And they're going to come to Tech starting June 24th through the 28th for that whole week to learn about African-American texts and use the BIP data set to go through some activities we have planned on vernacular in Virginia. Add more to that.
Okay, so the HBCUs are Virginia State and Virginia Union. They get the $500 stipend. We're gamifying the institute. So at every, I guess, milestone that they have, we're interacting with the data set or finding things within the data set. We were even thinking about documentation, which was why I asked a particular question about plain text, because we were thinking about ways for them to document in a way that could be shared among them. So we're working with a librarian who does gaming to use Mentimeter, and we have a VR component as a VR log that they're going to do daily. And yeah, so we're gearing up for that. And so my mind is going in a bunch of different directions. But we have documented some of the earliest uses of Virginia within the PhiloLogic data set, the latest mention, the most mentions by a particular author. So we're tracking all of this. So when the students do it themselves, we have some kind of guidelines. We kind of know what the data set is doing ourselves. So we could, help them kind of think about research questions to ask about the data set within the week. One thing to note, the book Groove, Bang, and Jive Round is written as Jove Round in the PhiloLogic data set, so that may want to be changed there. But we're interested in any ideas. You could send any ideas that you have to Sarah or myself about building assignments around PhiloLogic, because that's what we're doing now, because we're gamifying it. So as students complete certain assignments, they'll receive more points to receive the badge at the end.
Okay.
And so if you have any ideas for building particular assignments around the data set and tips of how to search vernacular within the data set, and even, this is the third one, how to distinguish the name Virginia from the state Virginia within the data set. Would be something that,
Taisha, say that again. Say that again.
Could you
slowly.
repeat those 3 queries that you just had?
oh, the first is building assignments. So pretty much any pedagogical methods for using the PhiloLogic platform. Any tips on how to search vernacular within PhiloLogic, and how do we distinguish, the third, how do we distinguish the word Virginia, the state Virginia, from the name Virginia within the data set, were 3 things that came up for us immediately.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Do you anticipate that your participants will become interested in individual authors, or how will that sort of break down, do you think? Will it come more around individual authors or subjects or subject matter or topics or things?
Off the top of my head, thinking about their interests, I think some students who are interested in literary studies will become interested in authors, but we have some students who are interested in social justice and history, so they may be more interested in themes, but we're going to kind of put them all together and then see how they break off based on their individual or collective interests.
Yeah. And I have a question. Where do you put Edward P. Jones, even though he's associated with DC? He talks about Virginia a lot because he grew up there, and the settings for a lot of his stories are Virginia.
I would say DMV, the Northern Virginia, Maryland, DC area is just kind of almost, they're so interconnected.
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, that's what we're working. Anything else there?
Not really.
Okay.
Okay, all righty. Well, this is great. We will see you at, a couple of us will be at Furious Flower.
Yeah, Wintergreen. Y'all see you next week.
So we'll see you there. We'll see you there. Good. Okay, others. I know we're watching our time. We're good. We're pretty good. Updates, anyone?
Can our group ask a question?
Yes, please.
So one of the things that occurred to the biography group was that we have some loftier goals for categories, but we don't think are feasible within the time constraints of this project, because we think it would involve potentially maybe even archival research for some of them. But so we were sort of wondering if this group would be interested in sort of developing metadata categories that we add and that we work on, but then also having a separate, maybe some ideas for metadata categories that future groups could fill out and work on as a contribution. And we wanted to kind of run that by the rest of
the team is shaking their head vigorously here.
Yeah, the team is also sitting at the extreme end of the table, so the shaking might not be.
You can't see this. You can't see the shaking of their heads.
But yeah, go ahead, Susan. Yeah, that sounds wonderful.
So the point you raised is that you're right, because you are doing both well-known writers and lesser-known writers. The archival work is absolutely essential because you have to dig more deeply. Which was, and I think earlier the point we made is that a lot of writers, I guess Conrad was in a pre-conversation where many writers are not well known. So you're not going to find any bibliographic data on, you're not going to find any book reviews, you're not going to find anything. You might find something in newspapers about the appearance of a publication. But the sources for information are deeply buried into the archives if they exist. And so that raises another level of question. Archives that you have access to that are digitized and archives that are collections still waiting to become digitized. So the access question is big there. So.
Yeah, great, thanks. That helps, because we were sort of thinking we don't want to just reproduce the same metadata categories that have already been part of our contribution is thinking about other kinds of categories, but some of them require a lot more time and research than others. So this is helpful. Thank you.
So Susan, do you have any categories in mind that you'd like to talk about right now? I know we went over a couple at the CLA conference that I remember, but I was just wondering if you had any to talk about.
Sure. So some of the categories that Joyce and Ebony and I had talked about that we would like to suggest for future groups to work on, but aren't yet sure exactly how to frame them at this point, would be something about like collectives and kind of friendships and alliances between writers. So if there were a category for like, if there are archives that have letters between one writer and another writer, there could be a kind of category for that, but it's still sort of fuzzy in our heads. And I was even thinking, so collectives like, you know, the Umbra Collective, if you could sort of designate this writer was part of the Umbra Collective, and you know, you could have it even potentially at some point so that it hyperlinks you to other members of that collective, but it's still such a fuzzy category, and it would also require more archival research, sort of hunting down letters between writers and things like that. So that is one of the examples of a really ambitious category that we don't think we have the time or the resources at this point to work on, but we'd like to sort of envision what something like that might look like. And then the other example that we talked about at CLA was sort of writers' political affiliations, and something that's kind of messier that for a lot of writers sort of changed over time. And sort of Professor Ward was sort of helpful in cautioning us against taking on something that's that messy at this stage, but that's something else that might be really interesting to develop, and something that we don't typically see in, or at least I haven't seen in metadata categories so far, but that would be really useful for both researchers and teachers. I don't know if Ebony or Joyce, you want to add anything, but I feel like those are the two main ones.
I mean, I remember Dr. Graham we had a conversation recently about Hurston and her political activism.
That's right,
and
that's right.
And I'm certain that certain things like that could be quantified. I mean, the challenge would be to track their changing political affiliations across any given set of years. But I think it's certainly something worth aspiring to.
Yeah, the first one you mentioned, I think is really important in terms of what were those networks that writers were in. And, you know, the notion of writers groups, writers clubs, named organizations that people were affiliated with, and that has been a very important formative period for a lot of writers. And so finding writers who were connected to one another through some of these groups. When John O. Clemmons found the writers group in New York, lots of people came out of that organization and are no longer associated with that organization. We only know them as individual writers, but they were in this writing group. So I think that those kinds of factors do make literary history important, but it also helps us to look at trends and ideas and dialogues and debates and political alignments, because those organizations often were associated with certain political groups. So that's good. I think that kind of expansion of our metadata categories would be very helpful. Thank you. That was team biography.
Yes.
We've heard language, biography.
We have heard geography, we have heard biography and language. We are yet to hear from
so language, well, we heard language, bibliography.
So I had one question for language before we move on to bibliography. So I think Kirsten was talking us. So Kirsten, could you specify a theme around which you're working with? Any kind of research question you have in mind specifically about language? I mean, you don't have to have that at this stage. I'm just curious if you have any specific topic that you'd kind of honed in on. Right?
Do you mean as a group or individually?
You could do both, whichever works at this stage.
So as a group, we're thinking about naming practices. So how are we working with names as they surface? And our goal is to think about how these things relate to like the biography group, or to like the naming of people, or the geography group, like the naming of places. And when these things are existing in like very standard, consistent deliveries, and when they're vernacularized, in the sense of when they become like personal or made up, like fictitious. So that's the whole group endeavor, to kind of create this consistent lens through which we're evaluating the novels, and then kind of taking our departures with the various novels as they surface. So it may be that I discover that there are particular naming practices associated with learning institutions, because that's my individual project. And so I start to kind of follow that trail. So that help.
Yep.
Okay.
I had a small question for the geography team before we just move on. And I was just looking at the sheet, and I really like the information that I'm seeing over here, especially like things like street addresses and location of action in the book. It's all been filled out. And I suppose this is a process question. I was just going to ask if you could share what you went through to get so much detail for each of the titles that you put in it. Were any of the DH tools used, or anything that you used to come up with like street addresses for each of these books that you have there? I mean, I think this information is wonderful, and we could all learn how to maybe use our DH tools to arrive at so much detail.
I think with like some of the books, what I did was I actually went to not the PDFs, but to the OCR files. OCR files, you can do like quicker searches, different titles. So I would also start scanning through some of the books just to see different information. So for example, with like Paul Marshall, or one of her novels like to do about her childhood growing up in Brooklyn and her influence of her family from Barbados. I know she would like start mentioning several street names. And so I started searching using like this keyword searches through the OCR files. And so I would see them kind of coming up more and more again. I think it was like Lexington, I forget the other avenue. And I actually then went on Google Maps and I saw that they were like these intersection streets in this main part of Brooklyn. And there was like a park right there, right where the intersection was that she keep mentioning too. So using those kind of tools of the keyword searches plus like actually like Google Maps helped me get like a really good idea of the place she's describing, and like these intersection of these streets and like other public spaces that she's like talking about in the novel. And then like it helps me get a better idea of what she's wanting to talk about. So those are just some of the tools of just doing keyword searches through the OCR files, using like Google Maps or other things as I'm coming across names, and then kind of piecing those together to see, hey, is this relevant or not, or is just something like a random mention. So those are just, that's just an example I used with Paul Marshall, for example.
Okay, thank you.
Would it be helpful if we created like a process sheet?
That would be
Like to kind of
I mean, that ties in with what we were talking about today too,
Yeah.
in the web.
And like we could share that with the other groups as well, because clearly you're going through the OCRs and then you're using external sources to match up with what you find in the OCRs, and that collaboration is, I think, is going to be helpful for all the groups.
So we'll write something out and then send it to you so you can see what it is and give us feedback on that.
Great, thank you.
Now, I know that the bibliography group was steadily recording and filling in the spreadsheet, both in North Carolina and since. So I don't know if you folks from that team have some thoughts to add.
I do.
Okay, I thought you were about to jump in, Conrad.
Yeah, it's rather unwieldy. I'm kind of fighting with Excel on this because is when you're putting information in, especially, so what I did to make it easier for me, I went to authors I know automatically, which was, so I started at Baldwin and Tony K. Bambara. And when we're putting the information in for scholarly journals, it can spread the spreadsheet out so wide that when you go to look at it, you cannot see completely unless you go into the boxes itself. You have to scroll down within that box, and you can very easily overrun a box, which became very frustrating. So that was just one of those things. I mean, if it was some way I could get around that, it would make it easier for me. And what I would love as well is to be able to cross-reference, because with some of the people talking about in geographic, Ghost and Southern writers are geospatial issues. There's some literature that's just coming out on that. And it's just to look at things and be able to crisscross scholarship, even themes, if there's no scholarship on it, to kind of initiate people to look at it, to look at those issues in the coming years, because some of our writers are kind of not being looked at. Baldwin is starting to be looked at again because of the recent movie. So, you know, needing to be coming back into publishing. So those are just some of the issues. It would be nice if something could automatically match up with some of the other groups and what some of the subjects that they're looking at without you having to go look and see what they're doing and be able to support them in their scholarship. But right now, I'm just putting stuff in off of JSTOR and Academic Search, whatever I can find, and going in and just putting that in. But I have to limit it, or it will spread the spreadsheet out so wide that makes it very hard to look at it unless you reduce it down to 50% or so.
So an easy solution to that, Conrad, would be, I can see, I'm looking at the sheet right now, and a very easy solution to that would be to, first of all, spread the individual, what do you call it, the cells. You need to spread that out wide, and also you might want to just not add the URLs, because if you have the proper citation, that's basically all you need, right?
So less information.
I think I did one URL on one and I stopped, but on the others, I wasn't just doing scholarship. But I just went and I would copy, for example, I think on one, I did 5 different articles from 5 different journals. And I copied them together.
I see the problem you're talking about, where the cells are becoming like wider longitudinally, right? And I mean, the easy solution to that, and let me see if I can just do that right now and you guys can take a look at it. So,
and when I tried to make it go to the side, it just really ran.
Yeah,
I was fighting with the up or down.
I know we're coming close to our time, but thank you for, this is a really good problem. This is a good problem to try to address. And I know some of it came up in North Carolina. We were talking about what information we should record, you know, so you all actually brought that up earlier. So now that you have more practice with it, we can see that it needs to be addressed directly. So this is something we need to continue to
so the
talk
second
about.
question Conrad was asking was if there is an easier way for all the teams to communicate, if they're doing something.
Well, yeah, I think that we've been sharing information. So Sarah, you got any thoughts about that? I'm going to send it back to you because I know we got to close out.
I don't. Does anybody have suggestions on what would be a great way that we could all, communicate?
We're talking about that, sharing Google Docs, and you asked about.
Well, I wanted to bring this up too. I mean, we set up a Google discussion group, and I think that would be a really useful place for people to share questions, because this is the first time I'm hearing about all the different groups.
Yeah.
IDRH and library, Jamene and Erin and folks in the libraries are willing to collaborate, but we haven't had any questions. But if there was a central place where people could prompt discussions, make announcements, and become familiar with projects, that would at least be helpful for me to kind of keep track of what's going on.
And I think we are at a point where we can input more information in there. And so if people are feeling comfortable moving along and projects are developing and sub-projects emerging, so I think we do have information to share, to deposit. So we will need to think about that and take some action and develop the Google groups and files, and people can dump files in, but also they can add information. But I think we need to think about how we manage that information to take it back, bring the circle close here, that we need to think about how we name what we put up there, how we store it, so that we can all access and think about it consistently. Because if we have different systems for doing that, it could become even more unwieldy. So we might have to have a few guidelines for how do we want to do this. Some of the things that we learned from today. Managing the information that we're going to upload. So I'm turning it back to you, Sarah.
Shayna, I see you have something to say, or you're cutting out again, your volume. So I'll.
Yeah, we can't hear her.
Is that Shayna?
Shayna, yeah.
Oh yeah, for some reason we can't hear.
You want to do a chat? You want to write it? You want to chat?
You want to just quickly type it out in the chat box?
If you send us a few notes we can read.
Yeah. While she's doing that, I heard from the language group that they need to have some tutorial time with Hoyt, or at least Q&A time with Hoyt. Is that something that other groups would be interested in? Would you like me to set that up, for everybody, or would you like to set it up per group?
I think we should try to do that. Hoyt, are you willing to do that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Whatever you guys need.
That's come up several times about
Okay.
the interface. Yeah, we've had several questions, so I think we might want to do that, yeah.
So we'll figure out a time for an hour or so where we can all jump on and you all can have specific questions for Hoyt and maybe.
And in fact, the mails went out just last week about this from Hamza and me as well. So I'm just reminding all of you that if you need personalized conferences with either of us, just let us know. And I think it would be useful to do that. Even if you don't have a lot to go on right now, I think it's important that we kind of still maintain the conversation outside these official webinars.
Because the next one is not until August, so we want to do
Yes.
something in between.
Yeah, and so please just email me. I know Ebony emailed me today morning about a possible conference that could be set up with me next week. So just let me know and let Hamza know.
Yeah.
Yes, and if there are other consultants.
Rochelle, not Rochelle, I'm sorry. Shayna was basically saying if any tips for future scholars.
Yes, yes.
Something to do with that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we're thinking about our next round. They might want to know, we're still looking for the right grant proposal that we want to apply for the next round. So if you have any thoughts, please let us know. But we're searching far and wide for to do another application for our next round of scholars, so that your network will be expanded and you will have the opportunity to teach others what you've learned. So we are in that process. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll add, if there are any of the other consultants that you think you would like to work with, more of a one-on-one basis on your projects, feel free to reach out. If you would like an introduction, I'm happy to do that, or Dr. Graham is happy to do that, and they can provide you some additional help. But yeah, I will schedule something with Hoyt and let everybody know.
Yeah, and I know Kenton isn't here today, but I'm sure Kenton would be on board.
Yeah,
with
he's
that.
in DC running another workshop. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, we're out of time. Any final quick questions, thoughts, concerns?
I'm excited. This has been great, everybody, for me.
Yeah.
Thank you to our speakers, and thanks for everybody who attended. And we will, our next webinar is not until August, but we will be in touch. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Good weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.